She didn't even touch it. That's what broke Elspeth Calder first, not the words, not the laughter, not the way Cordelia Brass' voice carried across every corner of that store like a bell nobody asked to ring. It was the fact that her 9-year-old daughter had stood in front of that bolt of blue calico with her hands folded behind her back, careful not to touch what she knew her mother couldn't buy, and those women had laughed at her anyway. They laughed at her dress, at the patches on her sleeves, at the careful, crooked stitching that Elspeth had done herself at 2 in the morning after Nell fell asleep. They laughed like poverty was something a child deserved. And in the back corner of Calloway's general store, half hidden behind a stack of feed sacks, a man nobody had spoken to all morning watched every second of it without moving a muscle and started thinking. If you've ever had to stay quiet when someone humiliated the person you love most in this world just to survive, just to keep the roof over their head, then you already know exactly what Elspeth Calder felt in that moment. And if you've ever wondered whether staying quiet was the right choice, whether dignity was worth more than safety, whether there was any way to fight back when powerful people held every card in the deck, this story is for you. Stay with me until the end. I promise you, what happens next will make you feel something you haven't felt in a long time. And if you're new here, please subscribe and hit that bell, because I put out stories every single week that I truly believe are worth your time. Drop a comment below and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Every name in that comment section reminds me why I do this. Now let's go back to Cinder Hollow. The winter of that year came in ugly, and it stayed ugly. It wasn't the kind of cold that makes the world look clean and quiet. It was the kind that got into the walls of a house and settled there like a guest who knew nobody had the nerve to ask him to leave. The creek behind Willow Glass Crossing froze in November and didn't thaw until nearly April, and some mornings Elspeth Calder woke up before dawn and lay still for a minute just listening, trying to figure out whether what she was hearing was wind against the window glass or something she didn't want to name. She was 34 years old and she looked it, not in a bad way, in the way that a person looks when they've done actual things with their body and their hands and their time. There were lines around her eyes that weren't from laughing. Her palms had calluses in places most women her age had never had to think about. Her hair was brown going to gray at the temples, and she didn't do anything about that because there were approximately 47 other things she had to do first, and vanity wasn't one of them. Her husband, Martin, had been dead 2 years. Pneumonia took him in a wet March, the same March the creek flooded the south of field and ruined the seed corn they'd already paid for. Elspeth had spent the week after his funeral draining water out of that field with a borrowed pump and 2 borrowed mules, because there wasn't time to grieve and plant at the same time, and the planting couldn't wait. Nell remembered her father. That was both a gift and a kind of punishment, and Elspeth wasn't always sure which one it was on a given day. Nell was 9. She had her father's stubborn jaw and her mother's eyes, and a habit of going very quiet when she was thinking hard about something, which made her seem older than she was until she smiled, and then she looked about 5. She asked questions constantly, not the annoying kind, not the needy kind, but the kind that made Elspeth stop and actually think before she answered, which she sometimes resented and always secretly appreciated. They made the supply trip into Cinder Hollow on a Tuesday, because Wednesday was the day Silas Varick's messenger usually came by with whatever reminder the bank had cooked up that week. And Elspeth had learned to be out of the house when that particular knock came. Not because she was avoiding the debt she wasn't, but because she had found, through uncomfortable experience, that answering the door when she was already tired made her say things she later had to live with. Calloway's general store sat at the bend where Main Street curved toward the rail depot, and it smelled the way all good general stores smell, like coffee and sawdust, and something unidentifiable that might have been leather or might have been age. Elspeth had a short list: salt, thread, a tin of lamp oil. Flour if the price hadn't gone up again, and she was not optimistic about that. Nell walked beside her, skipping, not dragging, just walking. She was old enough to understand that supply trips were not adventures, they were arithmetic with boots on. They were maybe 4 minutes inside the store when Nell stopped. Elspeth noticed a half-second later the way mothers do some peripheral awareness that the small person attached to them has changed velocity without being asked. She looked back and saw Nell standing in front of the dry goods display, where Calloway kept his bolts of fabric stacked in a row by color. The blue calico was on the end. It was a real, particular shade of blue, not the pale, washed-out blue that faded in a season, but something deeper, closer to the color of sky at 4 in the afternoon in October, the kind of color that made you think of things being finished and right. There was a small white print in it, tiny flowers or maybe stars. Elspeth couldn't tell from where she was standing. Nell had her hands clasped behind her back. She was leaning forward just slightly, studying the fabric the way she studied things she had already decided not to ask for. Elspeth felt the familiar pull of something she'd stopped naming. It wasn't quite guilt, and it wasn't quite grief, and it wasn't quite anger. It was the specific feeling of wanting to give your child something ordinary and not being able to, which is one of the most quietly corrosive feelings a parent can carry. She was about to say Nell's name when she heard the voice. "My lord, would you look at that?" Cordelia Brask was standing near the ribbon display with Mirabelle Sloane, and both of them were looking at Nell, with the particular expression wealthy women in small towns sometimes wear when they've decided that someone else's misfortune is available for their entertainment. Cordelia was the wife of the man who owned the lumber operation east of town. She wore her money visibly and with intention. Mirabelle was her lieutenant, which was really the only word for it, the woman who laughed when Cordelia laughed, and pursed her lips when Cordelia pursed her lips, and generally functioned as an echo with better posture. "That dress," Cordelia said, not even lowering her voice, "has been repaired so many times I can't find the original." Mirabelle made a sound. "The patches have patches," Cordelia continued. She was actually smiling. Poor little creature. The store had gone quiet in the way that a room goes quiet when something is happening that everyone can hear and nobody wants to acknowledge. Calloway himself had gone very still behind his counter. 2 men near the back wall had suddenly found the contents of a barrel extremely interesting. Nell didn't turn around. That was what did it. That was the thing that moved through Elspeth like cold water and heat. At the same time, her daughter didn't turn around because she'd heard it. And she was standing there looking at that blue calico with her hands clasped behind her back and her jaw set in a way that Elspeth recognized because it was the same jaw, the same expression, the same act of refusing to let someone see that they'd landed the punch. 9 years old, already practicing how not to break in public. Elspeth set her basket down on the nearest surface. Her hands were steady. She wasn't sure how, but they were. She turned to face Cordelia Brask. Her name, Elspeth said, is Nell. Cordelia blinked. She hadn't actually expected to be spoken to. "That was clear. I don't believe I was speaking to you," she said. "You were speaking about my daughter in a room where my daughter is standing," Elspeth said. "So I'm speaking to you." The temperature in the store dropped another degree. Or maybe that was just the feeling of everyone in it deciding not to breathe. Cordelia smiled the way people smile when they're about to reach for the larger weapon. "I was simply making an observation. Nobody meant any harm." "You meant it," Elspeth said. "You meant every word of it, and you said it loud enough to make sure she heard, which makes it exactly what it is." Mirabelle had stopped making sounds. She was watching Cordelia. "Mrs. Calder," Cordelia said, her voice going smooth and flat in a way that was somehow worse than the cruelty had been, "you do understand that your account here is not exactly." "Don't," Elspeth said, one word, not loud, but something in it made Cordelia actually stop. The problem was that Cordelia was right about the account, and they both knew it. Elspeth's credit at Calloway's ran on sufferance and history, and Cordelia Brask was exactly the kind of woman who could make a phone call and change that by nightfall. And Elspeth knew it, and Cordelia knew she knew it, and for one long terrible second, they were both just standing there with that fact between them, like a knife on a table. Then Nell spoke. She still hadn't turned around from the calico. Her voice was very careful. "Mama," she said quietly, "can we just get the salt?" It was the most heartbreaking sentence Elspeth had ever heard her daughter say. Not because of the words, because of the tone, the small, practical, defeated tone of a child who had already decided that dignity cost too much, and they couldn't afford it today either. Elspeth looked at the back of her daughter's head. She breathed. And then she said to Cordelia Brask, very quietly, "My daughter's dress keeps her warm, and it's clean, and she has never once in her life made another child feel small for what they were wearing. Which means she has better manners than you do, Mrs. Brask, and she got them for free." Silence. Then, from somewhere behind her, the feed sack area, the back corner, came the sound of someone clearing their throat. Not nervously, deliberately. The kind of throat clearing that means I heard that, and I'm choosing to be heard hearing it. Elspeth didn't look around. Not yet. Cordelia's face had gone through several colors and settled on something between surprise and the very early stages of a calculation. Mirabelle had taken a small, careful step back, which is the body language of a person who has decided that whatever is about to happen, they would prefer to watch it from slightly farther away. "I see," Cordelia said finally. Her voice was clipped, pressed down, the voice of a woman rearranging herself. "Well," she turned to Calloway, "put my order on my husband's account." And then she walked out of the store, and Mirabelle walked out behind her, and the door swung shut, and the store exhaled. Calloway looked at Elspeth. He didn't say anything. He just gave her a slow nod, the kind that means that needed doing, and went back to his counter. Elspeth walked to where Nell was still standing. She put her hand on her daughter's shoulder. Nell finally turned around. Her eyes were dry, but the effort of keeping them that way was visible in the set of her mouth, and Elspeth felt something in her own chest that she couldn't have described to anyone and didn't try. "You okay?" Elspeth asked. Nell nodded, not convincingly but gamely. "It's pretty," Nell said, looking back at the blue calico. Then immediately, "I know we can't." "I know you know," Elspeth said. They stood there for a moment, the two of them, looking at that blue cloth. And there was no resolution to it, no comfort, no way to make the moment not be exactly what it was. Elspeth was not the kind of person who tried to paper over real things with pretty words, and Nell was not the kind of child who needed her to. "Let's get the salt," Elspeth said. They turned away from the fabric. And from the back of the store, a man who hadn't spoken once in the last 10 minutes picked the blue calico bolt and carried it to the counter. Elspeth didn't see it happen. She was already in the flour aisle, studying prices with the focused expression of a person doing math that isn't going well. Nell was beside her, reading the label on a tin of something, which she did whenever she was trying not to think. The man set the bolt on Calloway's counter. He was perhaps 40, big across the shoulders in the way that comes from actual work rather than intention, with a coat that was expensive, but worn the way expensive things get worn when the person wearing them has forgotten they're expensive. His face was not a face you'd call handsome in any simple way. There was something in it that had been through decisions, a few of which might not have gone well. "That bolt," he said to Calloway quietly. "What does it run?" Calloway told him. The man put cash on the counter. Calloway looked at the cash, then at the man, then at where Elspeth was standing across the store. He understood, and he was the kind of man who understood things without needing them explained twice. "Done," Calloway said. Elspeth came back to the counter with her items. She put them down. She noticed the bolt sitting there and felt something odd move through her, a kind of recognition she couldn't locate, like hearing a song from a long time ago without remembering the words. She looked at Calloway. "That's not mine." "Wasn't yours when you walked in," Calloway said, and left it at that. She turned. The man was standing a few feet away, hat in hand, not theatrically, not performatively, just as a person stands when they want to have a conversation without making it a confrontation. He had gray in his hair at the temples. His hands were the hands of someone who worked, even if that work now involved more paperwork than fence posts. "Mrs. Calder," he said, "my name is Garrick Thorne." Elspeth looked at him for a moment. She knew the name most people in 3 counties knew the name. He ran the T-Bar Ranch south of town. He had railroad connections that people talked about the way people talk about the weather, meaning often and without complete information. He was by most accounts the wealthiest man in the valley, which was not what his coat was advertising. Careful. Not cold, but careful. I had no intention of making a scene, he said. You didn't make a scene, she said. I made a scene. You just bought some fabric. Something moved in his expression. Not a smile, exactly. The suggestion that a smile might exist somewhere in the vicinity. I bought it because I have 30-odd ranch hands who need new shirts before spring, he said. And my foreman's been on me about it, but I need someone to do the sewing, and I've been told you're good. Elspeth looked at him. He met her eyes without fidgeting, which she noted because a lot of people fidgeted when they were telling half-truths. That bolt wouldn't make 30 shirts, she said. No, he agreed, but it's a start. A pause. Nell had appeared at Elspeth's elbow, quiet and watchful, doing the thing she did where she tried to understand adult conversations by studying the faces involved rather than the words. Paid work, Elspeth said, not a question, clarifying. Paid work, he said. Whatever your rate is, my foreman will bring measurements next week if you agree. It was not charity. He had been careful about that. She could see that he had been careful about that, and she wasn't sure what to do with the fact that he'd thought about it. Most people offering to help didn't think about how help could wound. She looked at the blue calico on the counter. She looked at Nell. Nell was looking at Garrick Thorne with the 9-year-old's unguarded version of assessment, no filter, complete attention. He bought the pretty one, Mama, Nell said, because she'd been paying attention the whole time, as she always was. Elspeth looked at her daughter, then at the man. I'll let you know about the shirt, she said. She picked up her basket and her salt and her lamp oil, and she and Nell walked out of Callaway's general store into the cold street, and she did not look back, but she was thinking very hard. Behind her, Garrick Thorne stood at the counter for a moment, not picking up his purchase, not moving. He was looking at something out the window, not at Elspeth, not at the blue dress wrapped in brown paper Callaway was quietly tying off, but at something down the street, past the buildings, in the direction of Willowglass Creek. His expression had changed. Whatever had moved across his face in the store, the warmth, the not quite smile was gone now, replaced by something more deliberate. More serious. The look of a man who had seen something he hadn't expected and was now deciding what to do about it. 3 men were walking back from the creek road. One carried surveying equipment. One was taking notes. The third one worked for Silas Varick's bank. Garrick stood very still and watched them walk past the window, and when they were gone, he paid for his purchase without speaking and left. He had plans to change. Garrick Thorne did not go home that evening. He rode south out of Cinder Hollow like he was going to, turned east at the fork the way a man heading to T-Bar Ranch would, and then pulled up his horse at the ridge above Willowglass Creek and sat there in the cold for a long time, watching the light change on the frozen water below. The 3 men he'd seen from Callaway's window were gone by then. But the marks they'd left weren't. Even from the ridge he could see the small orange flags they'd pressed into the frozen ground along the eastern bank survey markers, placed with the particular precision of people who had already decided what they were going to find before they started looking. He knew what a railroad survey looked like. He'd commissioned enough of them. He also knew that this stretch of Willowglass Creek was not on any survey he had approved. That was the part that sat in his chest like a stone on the ride home. Not the flags themselves, not even the fact that someone was surveying land they had no legal right to measure. It was the timing, the fact that a survey crew had been out on the creek road the same morning that a bank messenger had been seen riding toward the eastern farms, and the same morning that Silas Varick had been standing in the doorway of the Cinder Hollow Savings and Trust watching the main street with the expression of a man waiting for news he already knew was coming. Garrick had been in enough rooms with enough people who moved money around to recognize the shape of a plan, even when he couldn't yet see the details. He rode home and he didn't sleep well. The next morning he sent word to Elspeth Calder about the shirts. She almost said no. That was the honest version of what happened. She stood in her kitchen, holding the note his foreman had sent, a plain, short message, no ornamentation, listing measurements, and a proposed rate that was fair without being insulting, and she stood there long enough that the coffee she'd poured went cold. The money was real. The work was real. And the rate was better than what she got taking in alterations for the dressmaker on Calloway Street, who paid slow and kept detailed mental records of every favor she'd done anyone, which she was not shy about referencing. But there was something about the whole arrangement that she couldn't quite flatten out in her mind. Garrick Thorne had bought that calico before he'd said a word to her. He'd had his reason ready: the shirts, the ranch hands, the foreman's complaints, and the reason was plausible. She'd grant him that. She'd heard enough plausible reasons in her life to know that plausible and true were not the same thing, but they weren't opposites either. She wrote back and said she'd take the work. She did not tell Nell about the blue calico. She folded it into the bottom of the cedar chest in the corner of her bedroom and put a quilt on top of it, because she had an idea she was working out slowly, and she needed time to work it out before she said anything out loud. Garrick came himself with the second set of measurements, which was not strictly necessary, and they both knew it. He arrived on a Wednesday afternoon with his son, Bram, who was 11 and had his father's shoulders already developing, and his mother's eyes. Garrick's wife had died 3 years back, consumption. And the boy had grown up in the gap that left in a way that showed in small ways if you knew to look for them. He was polite but watchful, the way children are when they've learned that adults sometimes mean something different from what they say. Nell was in the yard splitting kindling when they rode up, which was a job she'd taken over from her mother without being asked around the time she turned 8, because she'd noticed her mother's hands were getting worse in the cold and had simply begun doing it herself without commenting on it. She had her father's stubbornness, and she had learned to apply it quietly. She looked at Bram. Bram looked at her. "Can you actually do that?" Bram said, nodding at the hatchet. "Can you?" Nell said. "Yes," Bram said. "Then you can help," Nell said, and handed him a piece of wood and pointed at the stump. And that was apparently enough social negotiation for both of them, because they just started working without further discussion. Garrick watched this exchange from horseback, and something in his face eased slightly, like a knot that had been pulled one direction for a long time, suddenly getting a little slack. Elspeth was in the doorway. She had flour on her sleeve, and she'd been aware of it for the last 10 minutes and hadn't done anything about it, because she was deciding whether or not to be embarrassed about it, and she'd landed on not. He was here about shirts. The flour was irrelevant. "Mr. Thorne," she said, "Mrs. Calder." He dismounted. He had the measurements written on a folded paper, which he produced immediately, which she appreciated. It was the body language of someone who understood that getting to the point was a form of respect. "I brought the rest of the hands' sizes. McCarthy, my foreman, couldn't come himself. Bad back." He mentioned what kind of shirt, work weight or Sunday weight. Work weight. They'll be wearing them in the field. Thread color doesn't matter much to them. Practical. She took the paper and looked at it. 28 men, sizes ranging from what appeared to be one very large individual down to what was probably a young hand who hadn't finished growing. "I can have the first 8 done in 3 weeks if the weather holds," she said. "Rest by end of March." "That works," he said. They stood there a moment in that particular silence that happens after the business part of a conversation finishes, but neither person has left yet. "Your creek's running low on the north side," Garrick said, looking past her toward the waterline visible through the bare trees. "For this time of year, I mean. The ice pulled back more than it should have." She looked at him. "You rode out to look at my creek?" "No," he said. "I noticed on the way in." A pause. "Has anyone been out here recently?" "On the bank?" Her expression shifted. She'd been carrying something too. He could see at some tightness around the eyes that wasn't just winter cold. Why, she said. Because I saw survey equipment coming off that road 2 days ago, he said, and he said it plainly, without softening it. Coming from this direction, she didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Come inside." She put coffee on. Not because hospitality demanded it, but because she needed something to do with her hands while she thought. Garrick sat at her kitchen table, which was a plain wood table with a burn mark on one corner from a lamp that had tipped over 2 winters ago, and he sat like a man who was comfortable at plain tables. Which was either true or a very good performance. "I've been getting notices," she said. "From the bank." "What kind of notices?" "Arrears notices." She kept her back to him, watching the pot. "Silas Varick's been sending his man out here twice a month since October. Says I'm behind, are you?" She turned around. The look she gave him was not quite offense. It was the look of a woman who had been keeping precise accounts of every dollar she'd spent and earned for 2 years, and was being asked to justify herself to a stranger, and she was deciding how to handle that. "I've been making payments," she said. "Every one of them. I have every receipt." "Then you're not behind." "That's what I told his man." She poured the coffee. Set a cup in front of him without asking if he wanted it. "The notices keep coming. Different numbers every time. Fees I've never heard of. Interest on interest." She sat down across from him. "I've been meaning to sit down with the paperwork properly. I just haven't had—" She stopped. Started again. "I haven't made the time." He looked at her. She met his eyes. They were both thinking the same thing, and neither of them said it yet. "You should make the time tonight," he said. "I plan to," she said. He drank his coffee. It was strong and slightly overbrewed, the way coffee gets when a person makes it in the morning and doesn't finish it until afternoon, and then makes more without cleaning the pot. He didn't mention it. Outside they could hear the sound of hatchet against wood. 2 separate rhythms, slightly different, finding a pattern. "Your son doesn't talk much," Elspeth said. "He talks plenty. Just takes him a while to figure out whether he wants to." "My daughter's the same way, I noticed," he said. She looked at her coffee cup. He lost his mother young. 3 years ago, Garrick said. He said it the way a person says something they've said enough times that they've learned to say it steadily, but steadily doesn't mean it's stopped meaning anything. She was sick for a while before that, so it was well he set his cup down. It was a long goodbye, and then it was over, and Bram kind of had to grow up twice. Once when she got sick and once when she died. Elspeth nodded. She understood the shape of that. Martin went fast, she said. Nell didn't understand at first. She thought he was still just sick and would come back from it. A pause. She figured it out herself. I didn't have to explain it. That was worse, somehow. They sat with that for a moment, 2 people who had buried someone and raised a child through it, which is a specific kind of experience that makes certain conversations easier between strangers than they have any right to be. "The creek," Garrick said, bringing them back. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer straight." "I generally do," she said. "Do you know what the water rights on this property are worth?" She looked at him. The kitchen was quiet, except for the fire. "I know what Martin paid for them when his father settled the property," she said slowly. "That was 20 years ago. Things have changed," Garrick said. "In the last 18 months, since the railroad started looking at expansion routes." He chose his words carefully, not because he was hiding something, but because he was not sure how much to put on her at once. "Water rights along a creek that can support rail operations. That's not worth what it was worth in your father-in-law's time, Mrs. Calder, it's worth considerably more." She was very still. "How much more?" she said. It wasn't a question with a rising inflection. It was a question that was really a calculation being done out loud. "Enough," he said, "that someone who wanted to acquire them cheaply would have a very strong reason to make sure the person who owned them didn't know what they were actually sitting on." The fire popped. Outside, the hatchet sounds continued. Elspeth set down her coffee cup. She stood up from the table. She went to the drawer beside the stove, and she pulled out a wooden box, the kind people use for documents and keepsakes, and things that need to be kept flat, and she put it on the table between them. Start with October, she said. They sat at that table for 2 hours. She had kept everything. That was the first thing that struck him, not just the receipts, but the payment records, the bank statements, the original mortgage document from when Martin had refinanced the property 4 years before he died, the correspondence with Varick's office going back 18 months. She had it in order. Not perfectly, she'd said herself. She hadn't had time to go through it carefully. But the order was there, in the way a person's papers are in order when they're organized in their head, even if not on paper. Garrick went through the numbers slowly. He wasn't an accountant, he had accountants, but he'd built a cattle operation from a modest inheritance and a railroad investment from very nearly nothing. And you don't do either of those things without learning to read what numbers were actually saying underneath what they were supposed to be saying. What these numbers were saying was not good. He started with October, like she'd told him. October was fine. The payment matched the receipt matched the ledger entry she'd recorded in her own book. November was also fine. Then December had a discrepancy, small $12 and some change, listed as a processing adjustment with no further explanation. January had a similar fee, larger. February had 2 of them. And then March had something that was not a fee at all. It was a reclassification of an old payment one she'd made in the first year after Martin died, when money was worst reclassified from principal reduction to interest, which had the effect of making her principal balance larger than it should have been, which then generated more interest, which then generated more fees. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was very quiet, and it had been happening for 2 years, and the cumulative effect was that Elspeth Calder, who had made every single payment on time or nearly so, had not actually been reducing her debt the way she was supposed to be. She'd been running on a wheel that someone had quietly tilted, and the harder she ran, the less ground she covered. Garrick sat back in his chair. He looked at the papers. Then at her, she'd seen it too. She was sitting across from him with her hands flat on the table and her jaw doing the thing her daughter's jaw did when they were refusing to let something show. And she was looking at the receipts like she was making sure she was seeing what she was seeing and not inventing it. How long, she said. As near as I can tell. Since about 14 months ago, he said. Slow at first, getting faster, the processing fees. Are invented, he said. There's no corresponding service. They're just numbers he put on a line and the reclassification. Fraudulent, he said, flatly. No cushioning. What he did to that March payment is fraud. She breathed out through her nose, one controlled breath. How much does he think I owe? According to his last notice, he's going to say roughly double what you'd owe if the books were kept honestly. And if the books were kept honestly, you'd be ahead of schedule, Garrick said. You might even have a small overpayment sitting somewhere he's not acknowledging. She stood up. She walked to the window. She stood there looking out at the yard where Nell and Bram were still outside, no longer cutting wood, but apparently now doing something else. They'd found a piece of rope somewhere and were engaged in some activity involving it that Elspeth couldn't quite make out from the window. He's going to foreclose, she said. It wasn't a question. He's going to try, Garrick said. On what grounds? If I'm not actually behind. He'll manufacture the grounds, Garrick said. That's what the fees are for. Each one by itself is small enough that you might not fight it. But they add up to a technical default that he can take to court. He paused. And the court in this county is a man named Orson Ketter, who I happen to know has had lunch with Silas Varick every third Tuesday for the last year and a half. She turned around from the window. You know a lot about what Silas Varick does. I know a lot about a lot of people in this county, he said. It's not a virtue, it's a habit. And the railroad, she said. You said things have changed since the railroad started looking at expansion routes. Her voice had an edge to it now, not quite accusatory, but not quite not. Are you part of that? He met her eyes without flinching. I have an investment stake in the proposed spur line, yes. So you have a reason to care about my creek that isn't about me at all. I have a reason to care about your creek that I had, Before I walked into Calloway's store yesterday morning, he said. Yes, he did not elaborate on this. He did not add anything. Just let it sit there in the air between them for her to do what she wanted with. Elspeth looked at him for a long moment. Her expression was not soft. It was the expression of a woman who had been doing the work of two people for 2 years and had learned to be suspicious of things that looked like help, because help had conditions, almost always, and the conditions were what mattered. What do you want from this? She said, specifically. What does it get you if Silas doesn't take my farm? It keeps clean water rights in the hands of someone who isn't going to tie them up in a land grab that would take 3 years and a team of lawyers to sort out, he said. Better for the railroad. Yes, and my water would be leased, not purchased, if you agreed. Fair annual rate, legal contract, independently reviewed, and you keep the land. He paused. That's the deal I'd offer, down the road, if it came to that. That's a lot of ifs, she said. It is, he agreed. She looked at the papers on the table, at the 2 years of careful, hopeless, tilted work laid out in black and white, the fraudulent fees, at the reclassified payment that had made her debt grow in the dark, while she was out in a flooded field with a borrowed pump trying to survive. She sat back down. I need to talk to Vernon Lyle at the merchant's office, she said. He keeps records of wire transfers. If money I paid went through his office before it got to the bank, his records won't match Varick's. Garrick looked at her. Something shifted in his assessment of her, not that it had been low, but it recalibrated. She'd gotten there on her own. He hadn't had to walk her there. That would prove the discrepancy, he said. That would prove the discrepancy, she confirmed. I can go in the morning. I'll go with you. You don't have to. I know, he said. She looked at him. He was not smiling. He was not performing anything. He was just sitting at her kitchen table with his hands around a cup of cold coffee, saying a simple thing. All right, she said. She didn't sleep much that night. She went through the papers again. After supper, after Nell was in bed, sitting at the same table with the lamp turned up and a pencil in her hand, and every number written down twice, so she couldn't tell herself she'd miscounted. She hadn't miscounted. It was worse than Garrick had said. Slightly, there were 2 fees in April that she'd missed in their first pass. Small amounts, easy to overlook. Nothing about it was accidental. That was the thing she kept landing on. Accidental errors go both ways. Sometimes you're overcharged and sometimes you're undercharged, and over time it more or less evens out. These errors only went one direction. Every single invented fee, every adjustment, every reclassification had moved the number the same way up. More that she owed, more interest, more leverage. It had been designed. Quietly, incrementally, by someone who knew exactly what they were doing and had counted on her being too tired and too busy and too aware of the cost of making enemies to look closely enough. That thought sat with her longer than the others. He'd counted on her exhaustion. He'd built his plan on the assumption that she would be too worn down to see it. She put the pencil down. She looked at the burn mark on the corner of the table where the lamp had tipped over. Martin had done that, actually not Nell, not her. Martin had been trying to read in poor light and knocked the lamp reaching for his coffee, and they'd both scrambled and put it out, but the mark stayed. She'd thought about sanding it out a dozen times. She never had. She thought about Nell's face in Calloway's store. The hands clasped behind the back, the jaw. She thought about the survey flags in the frozen ground along the bank, orange against white, staked out with the confidence of people who had already done the accounting on someone else's life and decided it was theirs to take. She folded the papers back into the box, very carefully, and put it in the highest cabinet in the kitchen, behind the preserving jars. Then she went to bed. She lay in the dark, and she was afraid. She was afraid the way a person is afraid when they have finally understood the actual size of the thing that is against them, not the vague dread of financial trouble, which she had been carrying for so long it had become background noise, but the specific, concrete fear of knowing that someone powerful had made a deliberate plan, and she was the target of it, and had been for over a year without knowing it. She was also angry. The anger was newer. It had come in somewhere around the third hour of looking at the papers. Quiet and particular and not hot the way anger is sometimes described cold. Actually, the kind of cold that doesn't dissipate when you warm up. The kind that gives you something to stand on. She was still afraid. But the anger was underneath the fear now, and that made a difference. In the morning, she dressed in her good wool and told Nell she had an errand in town and that Mrs. Plum next door would be there if she needed anything. And Nell accepted this with a nod that communicated she was 10 years younger than she sometimes acted, and also that she had noticed something was happening but had decided not to ask about it yet. She had her father's timing, among other things. Garrick was already waiting at the end of the road when Elspeth came out, sitting on his horse in the early light, breath visible in the cold. They rode into Cinder Hollow side by side, and they didn't talk much, and that was fine. Some things don't need filling with words. Vernon Lyle's merchant office was on the backside of the commercial block, the kind of office that handles the paperwork behind commerce rather than the commerce itself, wire transfers, account verifications, notarized receipts, the infrastructure of financial trust that most people never think about until they need it. Vernon was a small, meticulous man in his 60s who kept his records with a nearly evangelical attention to order, which was why both Elspeth and Garrick had walked through the same door at the same time, hoping he could help them. He pulled the transfer records while they waited. He pulled October 1st, then November, then the months after. He laid them on his desk. He looked at them, then at Elspeth's receipts, then back at his records. "That's strange," he said quietly. "What's strange?" Elspeth said. "These two transfers," he pointed. "October and November. The amounts match your receipts exactly. The money went through. I cleared it myself." He looked up. "But these?" He pointed to the discrepancy months: December, January, February. "These show a different amount on the receiving end. The money you sent was right, but what the bank logged as received," he stopped. "Is less," Garrick said. "Considerably," Vernon said. The three of them looked at the papers on Vernon Lyle's desk, and the room was very quiet, and what they were looking at was not a mistake. It was the edge of a thing much larger than any of them had expected. Vernon Lyle pulled a second drawer and began going back further, his face careful and particular, and the more he looked, the less he said, and that silence was its own kind of answer. "I'm going to need to verify something," he said finally. He looked at Elspeth. "Mrs. Calder, you have the original mortgage document?" "I have it," she said. "You'll want to bring it," he said, and his voice had gone very neutral in a way that was not reassuring. "There may be more people than you two who need to see these records." He did not say this lightly. They could both hear that. Garrick looked at Elspeth. She looked back at him. And the next moment, before either of them could speak, the door at the front of Vernon Lyle's office swung open, and a young man came in, pale, nervous, moving like someone being pushed from behind by something they couldn't see, and he stopped when he saw the two of them standing at Vernon's desk. Orrin Pikefield, Silas Varick's bank clerk. He was holding a folder. His hands were shaking. "I heard you were here," he said to Elspeth. Then to Garrick, then back to Elspeth. "I've been trying to decide for 3 weeks whether to—" He stopped. Swallowed. "There's something you need to see." He put the folder on the desk. "There's a second ledger," he said. "Silas keeps it locked in the back office. I made copies last night." His voice was barely holding together. "It's not just your farm, Mrs. Calder." He opened the folder. 4 of them. The folder sat on Vernon Lyle's desk like something that had been waiting a long time to be opened by the right people. Orrin Pikefield stood on the other side of it, still in his coat, still holding his hat in both hands, pressing the brim between his fingers in a way that was going to ruin the shape of it permanently. He was maybe 26. He had the look of someone who had not slept in several days, not the dramatic, hollow look of exhaustion, but the subtler version, where a person is still functioning, but their edges have gone soft, and their eyes are doing something slightly off from normal, tracking half a second behind the world. Elspeth looked at the folder. She looked at the young man who had brought it. She did not reach for it immediately, which Garrick noticed and understood she was deciding something about him first, before she decided about the papers. "You work for Silas," she said. "I have for 4 years," Orrin said. "I do the secondary ledger entries, correspondence. He trusted me." He stopped, corrected it. Past tense, present decision. "I've known something was wrong for about 8 months. I told myself it was a mistake. Then I told myself it wasn't my business. He looked down at the hat in his hands. He told me to draft a foreclosure notice last week. For your farm. And I sat down to do it, and I looked at your file, and the numbers didn't." He stopped again. "They didn't match. Not even close. And I've been in that office long enough to know when numbers don't match because someone made an error, and when they don't match because someone didn't want them to." "Which was this?" Garrick said. "Not a question. Which was this?" Orrin confirmed. Elspeth pulled the folder toward her and opened it. What was inside was not complicated to look at, which was part of what made it so damning. Simple pages, columns of numbers, account names on the left. But the account names were not just hers. She saw her own name, Calder E., Willowglass Crossing, and below it 3 others. Fenwick, Aldercroft Farm, Bruder W. Creekside Property. Sellas A&M North Bend Parcel, 4 farms, all of them along Willowglass Creek. All of them showing the same pattern of manufactured fees, reclassified payments, inflating balances. And all of them marked in a handwriting she didn't recognize, but assumed was Varick's, with a single notation in red ink. The notation said, "Target Creek Access." Elspeth read it twice. "How many people know about this ledger?" Garrick said to Orrin. "Silas and me." Orrin's jaw moved. "And now you, his surveyor?" "The surveyor knows what he's been hired to do. I don't think he knows why." Orrin finally put his hat down on the edge of Vernon's desk. His hands were still, the survey work that started 6 weeks ago. "I had to file the expedition records. The survey goes along the entire eastern bank of the creek, from the Fenwick property down to the Calder line. Specifically the bends, the deep water bends." Garrick was quiet for a moment. Elspeth could see him absorbing this and cross-referencing it with something he already knew, something he hadn't shared yet. "The bends are the access points," he said, mostly to himself. "Can't run rail water intake from shallow water. You need the bends." Orrin nodded. There was a confidential survey report on his desk 2 months ago. From a railroad company I didn't recognize the name. He caught me looking at it and put it away, but I saw the creek marked on it. All 4 farm parcels, highlighted. Vernon Lyle had been sitting very still behind his desk, listening to all of this with the expression of a man who had been in the business of careful record-keeping for 30 years and was now watching a large quantity of what he thought was solid ground crack underneath him. "Silas Varick sits on the county property board," he said quietly. "Has for 6 years. Yes," Orrin said, "which means he would know. He would know before anyone else what parcels were going to be valuable when the railroad expansion became public," Garrick said. He said it evenly, but there was something underneath the evenness that was not even at all. He's been sitting on that information and using it to position himself. Get the water rights cheap by foreclosing on people who don't know what they're sitting on. "Before the survey becomes public," Elspeth said. "Before the survey becomes public," Garrick confirmed. "Once it's public, the land values go up. The legal scrutiny goes up. And you can't just manufacture someone into foreclosure and call it clean." She closed the folder. She put both hands flat on top of it. She was thinking so hard it was almost visible, something working in her face that wasn't emotion, but was adjacent to it, the specific intensity of a person who has stopped being surprised and started being strategic. "How long do we have," she said, "before he files the foreclosure?" 7 days, Orrin said. "He told me to have the notice ready by end of week. He's going to serve it Monday morning. 7 days. She looked at Garrick. He looked back at her, and what passed between them in that look was not romantic and was not simple. It was the compressed, wordless communication of 2 people who have independently arrived at the same position and are checking whether the other one is actually standing in it. "Vernon," Garrick said, "I need you to pull all 4 account files." Not just Elspeth's, all four. I don't have all four, Vernon said. I have what's passed through my office. Fenwick and Bruder do some business here. The Sellas family uses the bank directly. Pull what you have, Garrick said. Date stamped, everything. That'll take me most of today. Then start now, Garrick said. And there was something in his voice that was not a request. But not a request. Vernon Lyle started now. Orrin picked his hat up from the edge of the desk. He looked at Elspeth. There was something he needed from her. She could see not forgiveness exactly, not that simple, but some acknowledgement that he had done a thing that had a cost, and that the cost was real, and that she saw it. You knew for 8 months, she said. It was not an accusation. It was just the fact stated. Yes, he said. I'm not going to pretend that's fine, she said. But you're here now. He nodded. His jaw worked again. He's going to know I was here, probably by tonight. Are you going back? Garrick said. I have to, Orrin said. If I disappear now, he'll know something's wrong and he'll move faster. I can hold the notice another 3 or 4 days before he starts pushing me about it. 5. He paused. He thinks I'm afraid of him. He's not wrong. But he thinks afraid means I won't do anything. Elspeth looked at him. Is he wrong about that too? Orrin looked back at her for a moment. Then he picked up his hat and left. The ride back to Willowglass Crossing was different from the ride in. That morning, they had been riding towards something they suspected. Now they were riding back from something they knew, and the difference in weight was considerable. The sky has gone gray while they were inside, and a few specks of snow were coming down, the fine, dry kind that looks like the air just changed its mind about being clear. Elspeth rode without speaking for the first half-mile. Garrick led her. 4 farms, she finally said. 4 farms, he said. The Fenwicks have been on Aldercroft since before I was born, she said. Harrison Fenwick is 70 years old. His daughter helps him work it. She paused. Walter Bruder has 3 kids under 12. I know, Garrick said. Do you know the Sellas family, Augusto Sellas? His wife, Marta. They came out from the east about 8 years back. He looked at the road ahead. They've had a harder time of it than they like to say. She absorbed this. He picked people who were already struggling, she said. He went looking for the weak spots, made sure everyone on that list was already close enough to the edge that a push would look like a fall. That's how it works, Garrick said. It's not genius. It's patience and access, and the willingness to do a thing that most people wouldn't do because most people have a floor. He said this last part with a flatness that suggested he'd met people without that floor before and had formed opinions about them. Do you have a floor? She said. He looked at her. It was an honest question, and it deserved an honest answer. And she knew it was going to make him uncomfortable, and she'd asked it anyway, which he respected. I have made decisions in business that I am not proud of, he said. Things I told myself were just business that I now know were more than that. I can't give you a clean answer. I'm not asking for a clean answer, she said. I'm asking for a true one. Then yes, he said, I have a floor. I know where it is because I've stood on it a few times. She looked at him for a moment, then looked back at the road. All right, she said. She had not been back at Willowglass Crossing for 20 minutes when she found the stakes. She'd gone to check the south gate, a habit from winter, making sure the latch hadn't frozen shut again the way it had twice in January. And she walked the fence line east because she'd been meaning to look at the corner post that had been leaning since October. She walked maybe 300 feet along the creek bank, and then she stopped. 4 stakes. Orange-tipped, iron-driven, standing in her frozen ground in a line that ran parallel to the creek but set back from it not along the actual boundary she knew, but about 20 feet inside it. Her pasture side. She stood there and looked at them. Her first thought was practical. She was cold. Her second thought was detailed and specific and cannot be printed here, but expressed her opinion of Silas Varick in the clearest possible terms her mind could generate. Her third thought was the one that mattered. These stakes represented a boundary. A different boundary. One that, if left standing and recorded, would place the most valuable bend of her creek inside a newly defined county survey line rather than inside her deed. She did not panic. She did almost panic, which is not the same thing. The difference is about 3 seconds of very deliberate breathing. Then she went back to the house and saddled her horse and rode to Garrick's. He saw her face when she arrived at T-Bar, and he came down off the porch before she'd fully stopped the horse. She told him about the stakes in approximately 40 words, which was about how many she had available on the subject before the controlled breathing was going to need more maintenance. When were they put in, he said. Couldn't have been long. The ground around them wasn't settled. Today, maybe last night. He turned to his foreman, McCarthy, who was standing nearby, bad back and all. The kind of man whose bad back didn't seem to actually slow him down, and said something quiet. McCarthy went immediately toward the stable. "What are you doing?" Elspeth said. "I'm going to see them. I know you're going to see them." "What are you doing about them?" "That depends on what they're connected to," Garrick said. "Those stakes don't mean anything on their own. Someone has to have filed a survey amendment with the county to give them legal weight. If they haven't filed yet, they're just metal in the ground." He looked at her. "Do you have the original deed, the one that shows the creek boundary?" "At home. Get it," he said. "Tonight. Put it somewhere you can get to it fast." She looked at him. "You think he'd try to— I think we just found out this man has been running a systematic fraud against 4 families for over a year without anyone stopping him," Garrick said. "So yes, I think he might try things." McCarthy came back with horses. He handed one set of reins to Garrick and looked at Elspeth. "You coming?" "Obviously," she said. The stakes were exactly where she'd described them. Garrick crouched next to the nearest one and examined the ground around it without pulling it out. He wanted to see the angle, the depth, the exact positioning. McCarthy stood with him, and they talked in low voices about the surveying methodology, while Elspeth stood back and waited, which she did with the compressed patience of someone who is letting other people finish their expertise before resuming her own. "This wasn't done by an amateur," McCarthy said. "The line is precise. Whoever set these knows what they're doing technically." "Technically, yes," Garrick said. He stood up. "Legally is different." He looked at Elspeth. "A survey amendment has to go through the county recorder's office. I know the man who runs that office. His name is Dwight Carver, and he is not a friend of Silas Varick. Does that matter if Varick's already filed something? He can't file something that changes your deed boundary without a signed order from the county board, which requires a vote, which requires notice to the property owner." He paused. "Did you receive any notice?" "I receive notices from that bank almost every week," she said. "Half of them are nonsense. Did any of them mention a survey or a boundary hearing?" She thought. She'd been going through those papers for hours the night before, and the word survey had not appeared once. "No," she said. "Then whatever he filed anything. He filed it without proper notice," Garrick said. "Which makes it either a mistake or a crime. And you think it's one of those?" she said. He almost smiled. "I think it's the other one." They rode back toward the house in the last of the afternoon light, and Garrick stopped his horse at the top of the small rise that overlooked the creek bend, the specific bend. The deep water bend that Orrin had described as marked on Varick's private maps. The bend where the water ran clear and deep even in winter. The bend that made this creek valuable to railroad planners, and therefore to everyone who wanted to own what sat beside it. Elspeth stopped beside him. They both looked at it for a moment. "It's just water," she said, not dismissively, more like something she was reminding herself. "It is," Garrick said, "but it's your water, and someone decided it was worth taking from you by any means available without ever once asking." She looked at the creek, at the ice along the edges and the dark, clear run of water through the center. She thought about Martin, who had stood on this rise with her once in the early years of the marriage, before Nell, before the hard stretch, and said that the sound of the creek at night in summer was the best thing about the place, and she had agreed and meant it. "I want those stakes out of my ground," she said. Not yet, Garrick said. Leave them tonight. We need witnesses when they come down. She didn't like it. He could see that. But she understood the logic, and she nodded. What happened 3 nights later was something Elspeth would spend a long time afterward processing in pieces, because the whole of it at once was too much to carry in sequence. She had gone to bed at 10. She'd been sleeping lightly for 3 days, not badly, not the dramatic sleeplessness of crisis, but the shallow, surface sleep of someone whose body has decided that the situation warrants monitoring even during rest. She heard the horses before she was fully awake. More than one horse. The sound of them moving carefully, which was actually louder in a specific way than the sound of horses moving normally, because careful meant slow, which meant deliberate, which meant they were trying not to be heard. She was out of bed before she'd decided to get up. She pulled on her boots and her coat over her nightgown and went to the window. 3 men coming up from the creek road, one with a lantern held low. One with equipment on his back that she recognized after a second surveying equipment, and one walking ahead of both of them, a larger figure in a dark coat, moving with the particular confidence of a man who believes the land he's walking on already belongs to him. Silas Varick. She had known him for 4 years. He was 50-something, heavy-set, with the well-maintained appearance of a man who considered his exterior presentation a business asset. She had always found him slightly unpleasant, in a way she'd never been able to locate a quality in his attention that was always about calculation, never about the person in front of him. Now, watching him cross her pasture in the dark, she understood what that quality had been. He had been looking at her property the entire time. Not at her, she did not wake Nell. She went to the cedar chest in the corner, and she took out the rifle Martin had left a Winchester that she had learned to use several years ago, because a farm with a 9-year-old girl and no man in it has certain practical requirements in winter country, and she loaded it. 4 shells. She'd used it twice since Martin died, both times at wolves on the south fence. She had not missed. Then she went out the back door and around the side of the house and stood at the corner of the fence between her yard and the pasture, and she waited. Varick and his men were at the creek bend. The surveyor was setting up his equipment. Varick was standing with the lantern, looking at the orange-tipped stakes with the satisfied expression of a man reviewing work he'd paid for. Mr. Varick, Elspeth said. All 3 of them turned around. She was standing 20 feet away with the rifle at her side, not raised, not aimed, but present. She was in her coat and her boots, and her nightgown showed at the hem, and her hair was down, and she was not a figure anyone would describe as imposing, except for the specific quality of stillness she had the particular. Stillness of someone who is not going to move and knows it. Mrs. Calder, Varick said. He recovered fast. She gave him that. I apologize for the hour. You're on my land, she said. At 11 o'clock at night, with surveying equipment. There's been a county filing regarding the boundary of this. There hasn't, she said. I checked with Dwight Carver this afternoon. A pause. Varick looked at the man with the equipment. A small adjustment in his expression, the recalculation of someone whose plan has just collided with a fact he hadn't expected. There's a public interest consideration regarding water access. He started. Step away from my creek, she said. Mrs. Calder. His voice went smooth and patient, the voice he probably used with defaulting borrowers, kind-sounding, implacable. The tone of a man explaining physics to someone who doesn't understand that gravity isn't personal. You're behind on your mortgage. That's a matter of record. The bank has a legal interest in the underlying asset, which includes the water rights, and when a formal foreclosure... I'm not behind, she said, and you know it. He stopped. She raised the rifle, not at any of them at the sky, the barrel pointing up, but the action of raising it changed the conversation. Those stakes, she said, are in my ground, not county ground, not railroad land, my ground. And you put them there in the dark because you knew that what you were doing would not survive daylight. You're making a serious mistake, Varick said. Tell me specifically what mistake, she said. Name it. He didn't name it. The surveyor took a small step back. I'm going to ask you to leave my property, she said. Once. If you'd like to discuss the mortgage, the bank opens at 8 and I will be there with every receipt I have and a copy of every wire transfer Vernon Lyle processed in the last 2 years. She paused. I think you should know that Vernon has been very thorough. Varick looked at her. His face had changed. The smooth patience was gone. What was underneath it was not pretty, not the dramatic villain anger of a man who shouts, but the flat, compressed fury of a man who has just realized his plan has been seen and is now doing the internal accounting of exactly how bad that is. He looked at the stakes, at the surveying equipment. The rifle still pointed at the sky. He said nothing. He turned and walked back toward the creek road. After a moment, the surveyor followed, and then the third man, and the lantern went with them, and the dark came back. Elspeth stood at the fence line and held the rifle and breathed and listened to the horses go. Then her knees did something unreliable, and she put her hand on the fence post and stood there for a moment, letting her body decide whether it was going to fall down or not. Decided not to. She was grateful. She was still standing there 10 minutes later when she heard another horse. A different direction from the north road. She raised the rifle again, her heart doing something erratic that she didn't have time to manage. Elspeth, Garrick's voice before she could see him. It's me. He came out of the dark on horseback, McCarthy behind him, and 2 men she didn't recognize who turned out to be a deputy, and a man named Olson who was, she would learn, the county sheriff's second. He'd been watching the road. He'd seen Varick's men ride out, and he'd sent for the sheriff and come himself. He was here, she said. I know, I saw them leave. He looked at the stakes still in the ground. Are you hurt? No. He looked at her face, checking the honest answer rather than the stated one. You told him about Vernon's records, he said. He could read what had happened in her expression. Yes, she said. That was going to come out regardless, he said. Better he knows we know, he paused. Did he threaten you? Not directly, but he's cornered now, she said. And I used that word, which I know you'll tell me was foolish. I would not use the word foolish, he said. He looked at McCarthy and the 2 other men. Tomorrow morning I need witnesses present when those stakes come out of the ground. All 4 of them, in order, photographed if we can manage it, with the deed boundary plainly marked. The deed is inside, she said. Good, Garrick. She said his name, and then she stopped, because what she wanted to say was several things at once, and she was not a person who said several things at once if she could avoid it. What she settled on was, he's going to move fast now. Yes, Garrick said, so are we. The next morning, at first light, she pulled the stakes herself. She had told Garrick she wanted to be the one to do it. He had looked at her for a moment and then said, all right, and stood back with the others, McCarthy and the deputy, and a neighbor named Purdy, who'd come over when he'd heard something was going on. The way neighbors do in country places while she walked the line. The ground was frozen hard, and the stakes were iron, and pulling them was actual physical work. Her hands ached in the cold. The first one came out of the ground, with a sound like something being corrected. She pulled each one cleanly and handed them to the deputy, who had a sack for them. She did not throw them. She did not make a speech. She just worked her way down the line, one stake after another, until there were no more of them in her ground. When she was done, she was breathing hard and her hands were red from the cold. Garrick was watching her from 10 feet away. He had the expression of a man who has just seen something that he is going to remember for a long time. She looked at the cleared fence line, at the creek beyond it running clean through the pale morning light. At the empty ground where the stakes had been. What time does the hearing start? She said. 2 o'clock, Garrick said. She handed the last stake to the deputy. Then I need to go get dressed properly. She walked back toward the house, and the men stood in the cold morning and looked at each other and did not say anything, which was the appropriate response. Inside, Nell was at the kitchen table, eating oatmeal, and watching the window with the expression of a child who had known something was happening all night and had waited with great discipline to ask about it until morning. Mama, she said, I'm fine, Elspeth said. I know you're fine, Nell said. I heard you go out and I heard you come back. She paused. Is it going to be all right? Elspeth went to the stove and put her hands near the heat because they needed it. She looked at her daughter, who had Martin's jaw and her own eyes, and better patience than either of them at 9 years old. I think so, she said. I think we're going to make it all right. She said it not as comfort. She said it as a plan. The 2 o'clock hearing did not start at 2 o'clock. It started at 2:43 because Judge Orson Ketter arrived late and offered no explanation for this, which was itself a kind of explanation. He was a tall man, angular in the way that some tall men get as they age, like something has been slowly pulling at them from above and the rest of them hasn't caught up yet. He had the measured, unhurried manner of a man who had spent decades in a room where everyone waited for him and had come to believe this was the natural order of things rather than a professional courtesy. He also, Elspeth noted when he walked in, did not look at Silas Varick. Not a glance, not an acknowledgement, nothing, which could mean they had the relationship of strangers. Or it could mean they had the relationship of people who had agreed, in advance, not to be seen knowing each other. She sat at the left table with Garrick beside her, and a lawyer named Holt Deering, who Garrick had telegraphed for the previous evening, a man from the county seat who had the focused, slightly rumpled quality of someone who was good at his work and did not particularly care whether you knew it. He had arrived on the morning stage with a leather case and a thermos of coffee and had spent the 2 hours before the hearing going through Vernon Lyle's documents with the concentrated attention of a man reading a map of somewhere he intended to go. Across the room, Silas Varick sat with his own lawyer, a man named Prescott who was local, well-dressed, and who had the practiced ease of someone accustomed to winning in this particular room. He had not looked at Elspeth since she arrived. He was looking at his papers, at Varick, or at the wall anywhere that was not her direction, which she found interesting. Varick himself looked at her twice. The first time was when she walked in, a long evaluating look, and she met it without expression until he moved on. The second time was after she sat down, and that look was different, shorter, colder, the look of a man who has made a recalculation and arrived somewhere he doesn't like. She thought about the dark pasture 3 nights ago. The lantern going away from her, his back retreating. She put her hands flat on the table and kept them there. The room was not large. Cinder Hollow's courthouse served multiple functions, and on non-court days the main room handled county business and occasionally served as the venue for school examinations. The benches in the back were full. Word had traveled, the way word travels in small towns when something real is happening, not through announcement, but through the specific, efficient osmosis of people who have been waiting for something to break open and have learned to recognize when it finally does. Harrison Fenwick was in the 3rd row. He was 70 years old, and he had come in his good coat with his daughter Ada beside him. And when Elspeth had passed him on the way to the table, he had gripped her arm briefly, just above the elbow, and said nothing, and she had understood everything he meant. Walter Bruder was there too, in the back with his wife. 3 of the Salas family, Cord Purdy, 2 men she didn't know who turned out to be from the county land office. Calloway from the general store, which surprised her, though perhaps it shouldn't have. He was the kind of man who showed up when it mattered. Vernon Lyle. Orrin Pikefield, in the second to last row, as far back as he could get without being outside, his hat on his knee. Sheriff Malloch Ward stood at the side wall. He was a compact, quiet man in his 50s with a gray mustache and the careful attentiveness of someone who has learned, over a long career, to watch rooms rather than people. He had come himself rather than sending a deputy, which meant something. Judge Ketter called the room to order, reviewed the stated purpose of the hearing a dispute regarding mortgage arrears on the Willowglass Crossing property, and invited Varick's attorney to present the bank's position. Prescott stood. He was smooth and he was organized, and he had clearly done this before. He presented the bank's account of Elspeth's mortgage history, the alleged arrears, the accumulated fees, the technical basis for the foreclosure filing. He used words like procedural default and contractual obligation and good faith administration in the careful way that lawyers use words they know are doing heavier work than they sound like they're doing. He placed documents on the table. He cited the mortgage agreement. He was, Elspeth thought, excellent at making a lie sound like arithmetic. When he finished, Holt Deering stood up. He did not start with documents. He started with a question. "Mr. Prescott," he said, "can you tell me what a processing adjustment fee is?" Prescott smiled slightly. "It's a standard administrative fee related to." "Can you point me to the clause in the original mortgage agreement that authorizes it?" A pause. "It's a standard industry in this agreement," Deering said. "Specifically, can you show me the clause?" Another pause. Longer. "The fee represents services rendered in connection with." "There is no such clause," Deering said pleasantly. "I've read the agreement 3 times. The fee appears in the bank's ledger beginning 14 months ago. It appears 17 times across 6 billing periods. It was never disclosed to Mrs. Calder, and it has no contractual basis." He opened his folder. "I have the agreement here. I also have the bank's ledger entries showing each fee. And I have the wire transfer records from Vernon Lyle's office showing the amounts Mrs. Calder actually sent, which do not match the amounts the bank recorded as received." The room had gone very still. Prescott was still standing. He had the expression of a man who has come to a familiar fight and discovered that the other side has been preparing for a different fight, a larger one, and that he is already in the middle of it. "The discrepancy," Deering continued, "between what Mrs. Calder paid and what the bank recorded is not a rounding error. It is not a clerical mistake. It is a consistent unidirectional pattern spread over 14 months that has the cumulative effect of manufacturing a default that does not exist." He set the transfer records on the table. "Vernon Lyle is present in this room and is prepared to testify to every figure." Judge Ketter looked at Vernon Lyle, who nodded once. Prescott looked at Varick. The look lasted less than a second, but the room was quiet enough that several people caught it. "Your Honor," Prescott said, "the bank maintains." "I'd like to hear from Mr. Lyle," Judge Ketter said. Vernon Lyle came forward. He was small and meticulous in person, and he was the same way in testimony, precise, economical, no flourishes. He had the credibility of a man who has never needed to sell himself because the numbers did it for him. He walked through the transfer records for Elspeth's account. Then, because Deering asked, he walked through Fenwick's. There was a murmur in the room when Fenwick's account showed the same pattern, the same invented fees, the same directional discrepancy. Harrison Fenwick made a sound in the 3rd row that was not a word. Ada Fenwick put her hand on her father's arm. Varick was looking at the table in front of him. He was very still, which was the wrong kind of still, not the stillness of a calm man, but the stillness of a man whose internal engine is running very hot and who has made a decision to show nothing. "Your Honor," Deering said, "I would also like to enter into evidence a set of documents provided by a current employee of the Cinder Hollow Savings and Trust, obtained at personal risk to that employee, which show that Mrs. Calder's account and 3 others along Willow Glass Creek have been maintained in a separate internal ledger." Prescott was on his feet. "Objection. The provenance of those documents." "I'll hear it," Ketter said. Deering put the copies of Oren's ledger pages on the table. He walked through them methodically. He did not editorialize. He did not perform outrage. He just laid the numbers next to each other and let the room see what they added up to. What they added up to was a plan, a systematic, patient, deliberate plan to push 4 families along a creek into foreclosure before a railroad survey became public information, in order to acquire water rights worth substantially more than any of those families had ever been told they owned. The room understood this. It understood it at different speeds depending on where each person sat and what they knew coming in, but it landed. Elspeth could feel it land not as noise, not as reaction, but as weight settling into the room. Varick's attorney requested a recess. Ketter denied it. "We'll continue," he said. His voice had changed slightly. Not dramatically, he was too controlled for dramatic, but something in his register had shifted. Some quality of patience that had been present at the start had been replaced by something more focused. He looked at Varick. "Mr. Varick, your attorney may call witnesses. But I will tell you that if any testimony contradicts the documentary record already submitted, I will take a very specific interest in why." Varick stood up. Prescott grabbed his arm and said something quietly. Varick pulled his arm free. "Your Honor," Varick said. His voice was even, controlled the voice of a man who has decided to try one more thing. "The documents presented by opposing counsel are copies of unknown provenance, obtained by means that—" "Lyle's records are originals," Ketter said. "Mr. Lyle's records show transfers. They don't explain the bank's internal accounting decisions, which are, Mr. Varick." Ketter's voice went flat and specific. "Are you testifying a beat?" "No," Varick said. "Then sit down." He sat down. It was at that moment, in the half-second of quiet that followed, while Prescott was leaning toward Varick and Deering was organizing his next document, and the room was holding the particular suspended breath of people watching something they'd half expected, finally happened, that Garrick stood up. He had not been scheduled to speak. Deering looked at him. Elspeth looked at him. He said quietly, "May I address the court?" "Your Honor." And Ketter, after a moment, said yes. Garrick was not a lawyer, and he didn't sound like one. He stood in the way he stood everywhere, without performance, and he spoke to the room rather than to the bench, which was either a layman's mistake or a deliberate choice, and given what he said next, Elspeth suspected it was the latter. "My name is Garrick Thorne," he said. "I hold an investment stake in the proposed Holloway Spur Railroad line, the line that would require water access along Willowglass Creek." He paused. "I want this court to know something about the proposed acquisition of that water access." Varick went very still. "The investment consortium behind the Holloway Spur," Garrick said, "requires approval from its primary investors before any land or water rights can be purchased or leased for railroad use. I am the primary investor." He let that sit for a moment. "No acquisition of water rights along Willowglass Creek through purchase, foreclosure, or any other means can be completed without my signature. No one connected to this railroad has approached Mrs. Calder or any of the other Creekside property owners about a legitimate lease agreement because no such approach was authorized." He looked briefly at Varick. "Any private arrangement Mr. Varick may have made in anticipation of acquiring those water rights is therefore not worth the paper it's on." The room absorbed this. Prescott was writing something. His pen was moving fast, and whatever he was writing, he was not showing it to Varick. Varick himself was looking at Garrick with an expression that had moved past anger into something more fundamental, the expression of a man who has watched the architecture of a plan he spent years building come apart in the course of a single afternoon, and who has begun the rapid internal accounting of exactly how bad his situation now is. It was very bad. Elspeth could read it in his face from across the room. She felt something she did not entirely expect, not satisfaction exactly, but relief so large it was almost dizzying. The foreclosures were frozen pending investigation. Ketter said it in flat official language that left no room for interpretation. No action could be taken on any of the 4 Creekside properties while the documentary evidence was under review. The bank's claims against all 4 accounts were suspended. Prescott requested 48 hours to consult with his client. Ketter granted 24. The room started moving again. People stood, spoke to each other, moved toward the aisles. Harrison Fenwick sat in the 3rd row for a long moment before Ada helped him up, and when he was standing, he pressed both hands against the bench back in front of him and breathed with his eyes closed, the long breath of a man setting something down that he has been carrying for a very long time. Elspeth sat at the table while the room moved around her. Deering was organizing his documents with efficient, quiet satisfaction. Garrick sat back down beside her. "That was not in the plan," she said quietly. "I know," he said. "You should have told me you were going to do that." I decided about 30 seconds before I did it, he said, which was honest if not entirely satisfying. She looked at him. The railroad thing. The consortium. The approval that's real? You actually have that authority. Yes, he said. And Varick didn't know. He knew there was a primary investor. He didn't know it was me. A pause. I don't advertise my involvement in railroad business. Too many people want favors. She thought about this for a moment. So he built his entire plan on acquiring water rights he could never actually have transferred, even if the foreclosures had gone through. The acquisition would have been challenged at the railroad level, Garrick said. Would have taken years and lawyers to sort out, during which time the lease revenue would have sat in dispute. He looked at the table. He would have gotten the land, possibly, eventually. But the money he was expecting the railroad contract that was never going to materialize the way he thought. He didn't know that. No. She let out a breath that was almost a laugh. He was so careful, and the one thing he didn't check was who actually had final say, Garrick said. They sat with that for a moment. Across the room, Varick was speaking to Prescott in a low, rapid voice. Prescott was listening with the expression of a lawyer who has begun the process of professionally disentangling himself from a client's specific choices. Sheriff Ward appeared at Elspeth's elbow. Mrs. Calder, he said, I want to take your statement about the survey activity on your property before you leave today, if you're willing. I'm willing, she said. And the stakes, he said. The deputy has them. We'll need a chain of custody document. Whatever you need, she said. Ward nodded. He looked across the room at Varick with the particular neutral expression of a law enforcement professional who has formed a strong opinion he is not yet at liberty to act on, but who knows exactly when he will be. Then he moved toward the back of the room. Elspeth gathered her papers and stood up. The trouble happened that night. She had known it was coming in the abstract Garrick's warning in the pasture, the general shape of a cornered man's options, but the abstract and the specific are different animals. And when she walked out to the barn at 7 in the evening to check the latch that had been sticking and found the door already open, she felt the specific version of it land in her stomach like a stone. The barn had been searched, not ransacked. Whoever had done it was not interested in chaos, which was its own kind of frightening. They were interested in the original creek deed, which Elspeth kept in a tin box on the high shelf above the tack room because that was where she'd always kept important documents. Tin box was still there, but it had been moved not far, not obviously. But she knew where she kept it, and it was half an inch to the left of where she'd put it, lid slightly ajar. She checked inside with hands that were very steady and a heart that was not. The deed was there. They hadn't found it in time, or hadn't taken it, she wasn't sure which. But they had looked. The other papers in the box had been disturbed. There was also a note, not fancy, plain paper, pencil, block letters. Drop your claim or lose more than the farm. She held the note for a moment. She looked at it the way you look at something when you need to see it clearly before you decide what it means and what to do about it. Then she put it in her coat pocket and went inside and sent Nell to Mrs. Plum's next door on a pretext about borrowing flour, and when Nell was gone, she rode to find Garrick. He was at T-Bar when she arrived, in the middle of a late supper with Bram and McCarthy, and he read her face before she said a word and pushed back from the table. She told him about the barn, about the box, about the note. He read the note. He folded it and gave it back to her. Physical evidence, he said. Don't lose it. I'm not going to lose it, she said, with enough edge that McCarthy, who was still at the table pretending to be interested in his food, hid something that might have been a smile. Are you and Nell staying at the farm tonight? Garrick said. Where else would we stay? Here, he said. It was not decorated with anything. Just the word. She looked at him. He looked back at her. And there was nothing in his expression that was asking for anything, not gratitude, not credit, nothing. Just the plain offer. Nell doesn't know the half of what's been happening, she said. She can think it's a visit, Bram said from the table, without looking up. He said it in the casual tone of an 11-year-old who has absorbed more than adults realize and is choosing his moments to demonstrate it. She won't ask. Elspeth looked at Bram, then at Garrick. Does he do that a lot? More than is comfortable, Garrick said. She went back and got Nell and told her they were staying at the Thorne place for the night because she and Mr. Thorne had business to go over early in the morning, which was true and was also not the whole truth. Nell packed a bag with the uncanny efficiency of a child who has learned to be ready to move and ask no questions, and on the ride over said, "Will Bram be there?" And when Elspeth said yes, Nell nodded and seemed satisfied. Garrick sent McCarthy to the abandoned freight shed on the edge of the south property that night with 2 men and instructions to wait and watch. He had a theory, which he did not share with Elspeth in detail because the detail was speculative. But his theory was that a man who had just watched 14 months of work collapse in a county courthouse and who was now looking at a criminal investigation was not going to go quietly home and wait to be arrested. His theory was right. McCarthy came back at 11 with a report. 2 men at the freight shed, a fire inside despite the shed being supposedly unused, and conversation audible enough through a gap in the siding that McCarthy had written down in his field notebook with the cramped, precise handwriting of a man whose job frequently required him to remember things exactly. Garrick read the notebook at the kitchen table while Elspeth stood beside him. What McCarthy had written was not complicated. Varick's voice, McCarthy knew the voice, had dealt with the bank himself giving instructions to someone identified only by a first name, Crew. Instructions about a document, a property deed, an address, Willow Glass Crossing. A payment, cash, to be completed after delivery, and then one more instruction, the one that made Elspeth's hands go cold when she read it. Burn it after, not burn the shed, not burn the evidence. Burn the deed, the original boundary document, the one that permanently proved where her creek line ran. The one that, if destroyed, would leave her claim to the water rights dependent on reconstructed records rather than primary documentation, which, in a legal dispute, was not the same thing at all. She read it twice. He was at the hearing today, she said. He heard everything. He knows the foreclosure isn't going to work now. So he's going to, she stopped. Started again. If the deed is gone, even if he goes to prison, the water rights are in dispute. That's what he's doing. He can't win, so he's going to make sure I can't win cleanly either. Yes, Garrick said. Then we go to the shed, she said. Ward is already on his way, Garrick said. McCarthy sent Olson for him before he came back here. Then we go meet Ward at the shed. He looked at her. You don't have to be there. That's my deed, she said. I'll be there. He did not argue. He went to get his coat. The freight shed was on the south end of what used to be the Hollis property, abandoned now for 6 years, the kind of building that accumulates on the edges of places too solid to fall down on its own, but not worth anyone's money to maintain. It sat back from the road behind a stand of scrub pine that was bare and skeletal in February and provided less concealment than it would have in summer. The light inside was visible from 100 yards out. They came in from the north with Ward and 2 deputies, on foot the last quarter mile, which in February in the dark was not pleasant but was necessary. McCarthy led because he knew where he'd positioned himself earlier and which approach kept them out of the sight line of the single window. Ward held up a hand at 30 feet out. They stopped. From inside the shed came the sounds of a conversation, lower now, less distinct than what McCarthy had heard earlier, but present. Ward did not go in loudly. That was not his way. He went to the door, tried the latch, found it unlocked, and opened it. Inside, a small fire in the iron stove, 1 lantern on a crate, Varick standing beside the crate with his coat on and his hat in his hands, and a second man Elspeth didn't recognize younger, rough-faced, with the particular watchful quality of a man who has spent time in situations where exits matter sitting on an upturned bucket near the stove. On the crate beside the lantern, cash in a rolled stack, a list of names on a piece of paper, and a leather folder she didn't recognize. Varick looked at the door. He looked at Ward. He looked past Ward and saw Elspeth. For a moment, nobody moved or spoke. Then the man on the bucket crew she assumed stood up, and Ward's deputy told him to sit back down in a tone that made it very easy to comply, and he complied. Ward walked to the crate. He looked at the items on it without touching them. He looked at the cache, at the map which, when he unfolded it, showed Willowglass Creek with all 4 farm parcels marked and annotated. At the list of names, which was the 4 targeted properties in Varick's handwriting. At the leather folder, which contained documents she would not see in full until the next day, but which McCarthy, reading upside down, would later describe as containing the confidential railroad survey that Orrin Pikefield had seen on Varick's desk 2 months ago. "Mr. Varick," Ward said. His voice was flat and professional. "I'm going to need you to tell me what you're doing here." Varick said nothing. "That would be your right," Ward said. "I'll note you had the opportunity." He looked at the deputy. Both of them, the deputy nodded. Elspeth stood in the doorway of the shed, with the cold at her back and the firelight in her face, and she looked at Silas Varick being placed under the particular custody of a law that he had spent 14 months believing he could outmaneuver, and she felt many things, none of them simple. She felt tired. She felt the specific exhaustion of a person who has been carrying a fight for longer than they knew they were in one, and who has now won it, or won this part of it, and whose body has decided that this is the appropriate moment to acknowledge everything it's been holding. She felt relieved in a way that went deeper than she'd expected, not just for the farm, not just for the deed, but for the 4 families. For Harrison Fenwick, who had breathed with his eyes closed in the courthouse, for Walter Bruder's 3 kids. For the Sellis family who had come from far away and worked hard and had very nearly been taken clean. And she felt something else, something more difficult to name, that had to do with the note in her pocket and the cold barn and the 6 months of invisible theft, and the fact that a man had looked at her life, her work, her land, her child's future, and had decided it was an obstacle to be cleared rather than a life being lived. She was not going to be able to put that down quickly. She knew that. Varick, being walked out of the shed past her, stopped. Ward said, "Keep moving, Mr. Varick." Varick didn't move. He looked at Elspeth. His face had come apart somewhat from what it had been at the hearing. The controlled smoothness was gone, replaced by something rawer, the face of a man who has lost and knows it, and is in the process of deciding what to do with that. "You think he's here for you," Varick said. Quiet. Directed only at her. "Thorne, you think he came to your store that day because he cared about your daughter?" She looked at him. "He needed clean water rights," Varick said. "He needed them in cooperative hands, someone he could negotiate with. Someone grateful." His voice had a curl to it. "He knew who owned that creek the moment he walked into Calloway's. He knew the value of what you were sitting on, everything he's done since then. Has protected my property," she said. "From you." "Has protected his investment," Varick said. "There's a difference." Ward put a hand on his arm and moved him forward, and Varick went, and the cold took him, was gone. Garrick was standing 10 feet behind her. She hadn't heard him come up. She didn't turn around immediately. She stood looking at the open doorway of the shed, at the lantern still burning inside, at the map on the crate with her creek marked in someone else's handwriting as a resource to be acquired rather than a place where she'd watched her daughter catch tadpoles in June. Then she turned around. Garrick was standing in the dark with his hands in his coat pockets, and his face was doing nothing performative, nothing calibrated. He just looked like a man waiting to hear what she had to say. "Is he right?" she said. Garrick didn't answer immediately, which she appreciated, because an immediate answer would have been a prepared one. "I knew who owned the creek," he said. "I knew the water rights had value." "That's true," he held her eyes. "I also know that the first thing I did in Calloway's store that morning was buy your daughter a piece of cloth, and I did it before I saw the survey crew, and I did it because those women had no right to speak to her the way they did." He paused. "Both things are true at the same time. I'm not going to ask you to be comfortable with that if you're not." She looked at him for a long moment. The cold was real. The dark was real. The sound of the horses shifting behind them and the distant lantern light from the shed and the exhaustion in her bones, all of it was real, and none of it was simple. And she had never particularly required things to be simple to be able to stand inside them. "All right," she said, not forgiving him for something she hadn't yet decided was wrong. Not absolution, just the specific acknowledgement of a woman who has heard a true thing and is deciding what to build on it. She turned and walked back toward the horses, and Garrick walked beside her, and the night was very cold and very quiet, and the deed was still in the tin box on the high shelf, and in the morning there would be more to do. The morning after Varick's arrest was a Tuesday, and Elspeth spent the first part of it doing the things she always did on Tuesday mornings, feeding the animals, checking the water trough, splitting the wood that had been sitting unsplit for 3 days, because other things had been more urgent. She did these things not because she was pretending nothing had happened, but because the opposite was true. Something had happened, and the farm was still there. And the farm required what it always required, regardless of what else was going on in the world. Nell watched her from the porch for a while, wrapped in her coat, not helping and not leaving, just being present in the particular way she had that her mother had come to understand as a form of company rather than surveillance. "Is it over?" Nell asked, when Elspeth came back to the porch with an armload of wood. Elspeth thought about the honest answer. "Most of it," she said. "But not all of it. There's a hearing next week. Some things have to go through the court properly." She set the wood down beside the door. "But the worst of it is over." Nell absorbed this. "He went to jail, the banker? He's in custody," Elspeth said. "That's not exactly the same as jail yet, but it's pointing in that direction." Nell was quiet for a moment. "Ada Fenwick came by yesterday when you were in town," she said. She said her father cried when he heard. Elspeth looked at her daughter. "Did she?" "She said he hasn't cried since her mother died." "That was 11 years ago." Nell looked at the tree line where the creek ran, invisible this time of year behind the bare branches. She said he kept saying he thought he was going to lose it. "The farm. He almost did," Elspeth said. "Because of us? Because you found out?" "Because we found out together," Elspeth said. "Several of us." She paused. "Orrin Pikefield found out Vernon Lyle's records, mister. Thorne." She paused again. "Harrison Fenwick had the same fraudulent fees on his account that I had on mine. He just didn't know it yet." Nell thought about this, with the focused, slightly furrowed attention she brought to things that mattered. "So it wasn't just about us," she said. "It was never just about us," Elspeth said. "It just started that way for me." She went inside to start the coffee, and Nell followed, and they did not speak about it again that morning. But Elspeth caught her daughter looking out the kitchen's window at the creek road twice while they were eating, and she knew the shape of what Nell was thinking, because she was thinking the same thing, that the ordinary-looking world outside the frozen creek, the bare trees, the track of wagon ruts in the snow, had been a different place underneath than it appeared. That someone had been planning and moving and arranging for a long time, invisibly, and the people it was happening to had been going about their days without knowing, and that was the part that was hardest to put down. Not the fraud, not even the threat, but the invisibility of it. The fact that it had been happening in the dark while they were living in the light. The formal hearing was set for the following Thursday. Holt Deering came back from the county seat and spent 2 days before the hearing going through the full body of evidence with the systematic, slightly airless thoroughness of a man who treats preparation the way a carpenter treats level, not optional, not approximate, exactly right, or it doesn't count. He had obtained, through channels that involved some very specific correspondence between himself and the State Banking Commission, a full audit of the Cinder Hollow Savings and Trusts records for the previous 3 years. What the audit found was not surprising by this point, but the scale of it was. The manufactured fees and fraudulent reclassifications had been applied to not 4 accounts, but 7. The other 3 were smaller properties, 2 of them owned by widowers in their 60s, One by a family that had already given up and left, moved east the previous fall, sold what they could, assumed their debt was legitimate. The family that had left was named Coulter. They had 2 daughters. They had been farming creek-adjacent land for 8 years, and they had left because the bank's pressure had convinced them they were failing when they were not failing at all. When Deering told Elspeth this, they were sitting at her kitchen table going over the hearing documents, and she put her pencil down and did not pick it up again for almost a minute. The Coulters, she said, yes, they had a farm on the North Bend. She looked at the table. Nell played with their youngest girl, Ruth. She used to ask about her after they left. A pause. I told her some people just needed to go somewhere else. Deering said nothing. He was not the kind of man who filled silences that didn't need filling. They didn't need to go, Elspeth said. No, Deering said. Is there any? She stopped. Can they come back? Legally, if the fraud is proven. Their account would be among those corrected, Deering said carefully. Whether they come back is a different question. You can correct a financial record. You can't correct 3 seasons of someone's life that they spent somewhere they didn't have to be. He paused. But they'd be owed money, and they'd know the truth of what happened. Picked up the pencil. All right, she said. What else? The Thursday hearing was larger than the first one. Word had spread the way it always spreads in small places. Not through any single announcement, but through the accumulated weight of people talking to each other in the way they talk. When something real is happening with that particular quality of lowered voice and slightly widened eye. That means this matters. You should know this. Listen. The courthouse room was full before Ketter called the session to order, and people were standing along the back wall and in the hallway outside the open door, and Elspeth, coming in with Deering and Garrick, had to navigate the space carefully. She saw faces she knew, faces she didn't. Ada Fenwick with her father, Harrison in his good coat again, sitting straighter than he had the week before. The Brooders, Augusto Sellas in the 3rd row with Marta beside him, her hand inside his elbow. Calloway, Vernon Lyle, Cord Purdy, 3 men she didn't recognize who Deering had told her were from the State Banking Commission, there to observe. Orrin Pikefield was in the 2nd row, not the last one this time. He'd moved forward. Elspeth noted this without comment. Varick was not present at the public hearing. He was represented by Prescott, who had managed to maintain a professional expression of neutrality through what must have been a genuinely difficult week for him. There were rumors that Prescott had withdrawn from 2 other cases to concentrate on this one, and other rumors that he was preparing to argue for a plea negotiation, and other rumors that he had been seen eating lunch alone at a table where he usually ate with 3 other lawyers, and nobody had joined him. Elspeth didn't know which of these was true and didn't particularly care. Ketter opened the session. He was more precise than he had been at the first hearing. The quality of his attention was different. The way a man's attention changes when he has privately decided something and is now proceeding with its execution. He had read the audit, she could tell. Deering went through the full scope of the fraud. He was methodical and he was complete and he did not editorialize, which made it worse, somehow, than if he'd tried to make it dramatic. The numbers made it dramatic on their own. 7 accounts. 31 months of systematic manipulation. A total of what the audit calculated to be approximately $11,000 in fraudulent fees and fictitious arrears across all affected accounts money that had either been paid by the account holders and not properly credited, or money that had never been owed but had been represented as owed in order to manufacture default. $11,000 spread across 7 families over nearly 3 years. When Deering said the number, the room was quiet for a beat, and then a sound went through it that was not quite a gasp and not quite a murmur, something between the two. The involuntary sound of people absorbing something that is larger than they expected. Harrison Fenwick put his face in his hands. Ada rubbed his back in small circles, the way you rub someone's back when there are no words for the thing they're feeling. The Coulter account was included in the documentation. Deering noted that the family had relocated and that the banking commission had been asked to initiate contact to inform them of the findings and the corrective measures. Marticelus was crying quietly. Augusto was not crying. He was looking at the front of the room with an expression that was beyond anger and beyond relief, something more elemental, the expression of a man who has been told that what he thought was his failure was actually someone else's crime, and who is in the early fragile moments of understanding what that means about the last 2 years of his life. Elspeth watched him and felt something she could not entirely name. Solidarity was too clean a word. It was more personal than that, more complicated, something about recognizing in another person's face the specific wound of having worked hard in good faith and been undermined anyway, and of having believed for too long that the problem was yourself. She had believed that, longer than she wanted to admit. That somehow, if she were more careful, more diligent, better with the numbers, less costly, that the slowly rising debt was something she could outrun through effort. That the wheel was level and she just wasn't running fast enough. She had not been running slowly. The wheel had been tilted. There is a particular kind of shame that attaches itself to financial struggle, especially for women in small towns, especially for widows, the assumption that debt is evidence of personal failing rather than circumstance, that being behind means you did something wrong, that the banker who sends you notices is responding to facts rather than creating them. Elspeth had worn that shame like a coat she couldn't take off, had felt it in every trip to Calloway's, where she bought less than she needed, and in every visit to the bank where she was careful with her words, because she could not afford to be otherwise. She thought about all of that now, sitting in the front of a courtroom that was packed with people who were finally looking at what had actually happened, and she felt the coat come off. She had not failed. She had been stolen from. Those are different things. And the difference matters enormously, and she had not known which one it was for 2 years, and now she did. Ketter spent the afternoon portions of the session on the specific legal remedies. The fraudulent foreclosure filings were voided, all 7 of them, including the 3 that had not yet been formally served. The fictitious fees were erased from every account. The fraudulent reclassifications were reversed, restoring each mortgage to the state it would have been in had the accounts been maintained honestly from the beginning. Then the accounting correction reached Elspeth's account, and something happened that she had not expected. Deering had been going through her numbers with Garrick's accountant the previous day, but he had told her to wait for the official calculation. She had waited impatiently, in the way you wait for something when you know it's going to be significant and don't know in which direction. The accountant's representative stood up and read the corrected balance for Calder, E. Willowglass Crossing. The corrected balance was negative, not in the sense of debt, in the sense that the bank owed her money. Martin's mortgage, the one he'd taken out and had been paying down, and that she had continued paying down, carefully, every month, in receipts she'd kept in the wooden box in the kitchen drawer had, when properly calculated, been fully retired 14 months ago. The payments she'd made since then were overpayments, and the fraudulent fees, which she had partially absorbed into her payment structure, trying to make numbers work, added further to the amount owed to her rather than from her. The room heard the number. Elspeth heard the number. She sat very still for a moment. Beside her, Garrick said nothing. He was watching her face with the careful attention of someone who wants to see a thing happen and doesn't want to interrupt it by commenting on it. "The mortgage," she said, quietly, to Deering. "It's paid." "Has been," Deering said. For over a year, she looked at the front of the room. At the document the accountant had read from, at the number she had not expected and was not sure yet how to hold. Martin had paid it. She had finished paying it. In the months after he died, when she had been draining the flooded field and rationing flour and learning to do alone everything that had been 2 people's work, she had also been making the last payments on this land, and she had not known it. Because the bank had made sure she didn't know it, because a paid mortgage was a free woman, and a free woman was harder to maneuver. She pressed her lips together. She was not going to cry in the courthouse. That was a decision she made and kept, but it was a near thing. Silas Varick did not fight the charges. This surprised almost everyone. Prescott had signaled for 2 days that there might be a defense mounted on the grounds of accounting error and misunderstanding, the kind of soft-focused argument that doesn't require proving innocent so much as proving fog that the books were complicated and interpretations differed, and perhaps certain fees were not optimally disclosed but were. Not necessarily fraudulent in the strictest sense. What ended that argument was Orrin Pikefield's testimony. Orrin testified for 2 hours on a Friday morning, and he was not dramatic about it. He was the opposite of dramatic, which was somehow worse for Varick's position. He was specific. He remembered dates. He had copies of documents. Precise copies he had made at personal risk on 3 separate nights over the course of a week, and he answered every question, daring put to him with the careful, undecorated honesty of a man who has decided that the cost of silence is higher than the cost of speaking, even when speaking is not easy. He described being asked to falsify entries. He described being told the manufactured fees were industry standard adjustments when he first questioned them, and being told later, when he questioned them again, to stop questioning them. He described the second ledger and how it was kept and who had access to it, and when the Creekside accounts had been flagged as targets within it. He described the railroad survey document he'd seen on Varick's desk, and what it showed and what Varick had said when he'd caught him looking at it. He described drafting the foreclosure notice for Willowglass Crossing and stopping, and looking at the numbers and knowing. He was 26 years old, and he had made a serious mistake that had lasted 8 months, and he did not ask the room to forgive him for it. He just said what had happened plainly, and let it be what it was. Prescott attempted a cross-examination that lasted 40 minutes and accomplished very little, because Orrin Pikefield had told the truth, and the truth is a very difficult thing to chip away at through questioning. Varick, watching from the defendant's table, stopped looking at the front of the room about an hour into Orrin's testimony. He looked at his hands instead. He looked at them for a long time. The plea negotiation began that afternoon. The outcome was not everything anyone might have wished, because outcomes rarely are. Varick did not go to prison immediately. The plea process took weeks, and there were legal complexities around the banking charter and the property board and his connections to county administration that took time to untangle. But he was removed from the bank. The Cinder Hollow Savings and Trust was placed under state oversight, and a new administrator was appointed from outside the county. A woman from the capital named Harriet Bloom, who had the reputation of being fair and the manner of someone who had heard every excuse and stopped finding them interesting some years ago. Varick's plea, when it was finalized, included full restitution across all 7 accounts and a 5-year term, the conditions of which would keep him out of banking and out of Cinder Hollow. It was not everything. The Coulter family, Elspeth, thought about them more than she let on, had lost 3 seasons. Ruth Coulter, Nell's friend, had grown up somewhere else. That couldn't be corrected by restitution. The Sellis family had spent a winter believing they were going to lose the land they'd given everything to reach, and Augusto Sellis had a way of going quiet in the middle of sentences that Marta said he hadn't had before. A small pause that appeared when he was thinking about certain things, and that probably wasn't going away. Harrison Fenwick said, when it was done, that he didn't feel like celebrating. He said it quietly to Ada, not meaning for Elspeth to hear, but she did. He said he was glad. He said it was right. But he felt like something had been taken from him even in the winning, some version of his belief about how things worked, some assumption that had been naive and that he'd carried comfortably for 70 years without knowing it was naive. And now it was gone. Elspeth understood this completely. She'd been thinking about it herself, in the weeks since the freight shed, in the slow process of returning to ordinary life, doing the sewing work, managing the farm, helping Nell with her schoolwork. Not sleeping always well, but sleeping better than she had in months. She'd been thinking about what it meant to discover that the world you thought you were living in had a different version underneath it, running on different rules, operated by people who looked at the surface version you were living in and saw only what they could extract from it. The answer she kept arriving at was not comfortable, but it was true. The uncomfortable version is always the true one. The world contains both versions and always has. The question is not whether you can avoid the second version you can't, entirely, but whether you can see it when it's present, and whether you can do something about it when you do. She had not seen it soon enough. She might have been easier to see if she hadn't been so tired, if Martin hadn't died when he did, if she hadn't spent 2 years just trying to stay upright. But she had seen it, and she had done something about it. And that was the part she was going to carry forward. Garrick came by Willowglass Crossing on a Saturday afternoon in March, when the ice on the creek had finally broken and the water was running high and loud the way it does in early thaw, making a sound that fills the whole of a property and makes it feel more alive than it does in any other season. He had Bram with him. Bram and Nell had developed over the winter the kind of friendship that exists in a specific register between children who are slightly different ages and have slightly different personalities, but have discovered a complementary stubbornness, Bram methodical, Nell impulsive, and yet somehow they argued rarely and worked together well and seemed to occupy the same general frequency. They went off toward the creek immediately, Nell ahead and Bram following at a pace that preserved his dignity, and Elspeth watched them go from the repaired porch, the porch that had been repaired in February by Cord Purdy and 2 of his sons, who had arrived one morning with lumber and tools and refused payment in the particular way that people in country places sometimes do when they have decided that something needs doing. Garrick sat on the porch step. He had his hat in his hands, which Elspeth had noticed was what he did when he wasn't performing anything. The hat came off, and he just held it. "The lease offer," he said. "I want to go through it with you properly." "Whenever you're ready." "I've been through it," she said. 3 times. Deering looked at it. He did. He had 2 comments. "I went back to your man with both of them, and he adjusted the language." She looked at the creek. "Fair, but," he said, "because there was one." "No but," she said. "I'm going to sign it." She paused. "I just wanted you to know that I read it carefully." "All of it. I would have been concerned if you hadn't," he said. She looked at him. "The other 3 families," she said. "Harrison Bruder, the Sellis family. You sent them the same offer?" "I sent them all the same terms," he said. "Same rate. Same boundary protections. Same independent review clause." A pause. "Harrison said he needed to think about it." Bruder said yes immediately. "Augusto Sellis asked me 6 questions in a row and then said he'd let me know." "Did that bother you? The questions?" "No," Garrick said. "Good questions." He looked at the creek. "Augusto knows water. He knows what he's sitting on better than I do in some ways. He's been managing that bend for 8 years. She thought about the lease. About what it meant, not the money. Though the money was real and would matter, would repair the barn roof fully, would buy seed without rationing, would let Nell have new boots before spring rather than in late summer when things got bad enough that there was no choice. The money mattered, but what she kept thinking about was not the money, but the clause that said the water rights remained hers. The lease was a lease, not a sale, not a transfer, not a slow-motion acquisition dressed up as a partnership. The creek ran past her property, and it would continue to run past her property, and what moved in it would be used and shared, and would generate something for her, and for the railroad, and for everyone along that line. And at the end of it, the water would still be hers. That was the part she was going to sign. "I want to tell you something," she said. He looked at her. "What Varick said in the freight shed," she said. "About why you were here, about the creek and the investment." "Let me finish," she said, not unkindly. "He wasn't entirely wrong. You had reasons, business reasons, good ones, that existed before you ever spoke to me. And I've thought about that, and I've landed somewhere with it that I want to say out loud." He waited. His hat was very still in his hands. Most things people do have more than one reason, she said. Martin used to say that only saints and idiots act from a single motive, and he didn't have much patience for either. She looked at the creek. You bought that calico because you were angry that those women treated my daughter that way. I believe that. I also believe you had reasons to care about this property that had nothing to do with my daughter. Both of those things can be true, and the first one can still matter. He was looking at her with the expression of a man who is listening in the full sense of the word. What I decided, she said, is that I don't need your reasons to be pure to trust them. I just need them to be honest. And I think they have been. She looked at him. Have they? Yes, he said simply. Then that's enough, she said. The creek ran. Down the bank Nell's voice rose briefly, and Bram said something in reply, and then they were both laughing, the unguarded laugh of children who have momentarily forgotten to be careful about anything. Garrick turned toward the sound. Something in his face did what it did, sometimes eased, the way things ease when they've been carrying something and have a moment not to. Bram doesn't laugh like that with most people, he said. He was not making a declaration. He was just saying a true thing. Nell doesn't either, Elspeth said. They sat with that, both of them. And it was not a romantic moment in the conventional sense. Nobody reached for anyone's hand. Nobody said something that would sound meaningful removed from context. It was more ordinary than that, and also more solid. Two people sitting on a repaired porch in early March, listening to their children laugh by a creek, having come through something that had been genuinely hard, and having come through it together imperfectly, with full knowledge of each other's motives and a decision to keep going anyway. That is not a small thing. It is, in fact, a fairly large one. In April, when the ground softened enough to work, Elspeth planted the south field. She did it methodically, the way Martin had taught her, the way she had taught herself after he died to do alone what had been two people's work. She planted more than she had the year before, because there was money for more seed, because the lease was signed and the first payment had come through, and Harriet Bloom at the bank had personally called her in to show her the corrected account, the one that showed a positive balance for the first time since Martin got sick. She had looked at that balance for a long time. Then she had asked Harriet Bloom if there was any information yet on how to reach the Coulter family, and Harriet had said she was working on it, and Elspeth had said thank you and left. She thought about them still. She would think about them for a long time. About what it means when a wrong is corrected for the people who stayed, but can't be fully corrected for the people who left. About the limits of justice, that it can repair records but not time, restore balances, but not the winters spent believing you had failed when you hadn't. She wasn't sure what to do with that. She wasn't sure there was anything to do with it beyond carrying it and letting it inform how you act toward people in the future, which was not sufficient but was not nothing. The sewing work had grown. 3 more ranch accounts, 2 of them Garrick's recommendation, and one she'd gotten herself through Ada Fenwick, who had mentioned her mother's skill to someone who'd mentioned it to someone else. The word-of-mouth chain that is both the most reliable and most frustrating form of advertising. She had begun to think about what it would mean to have a proper sewing room rather than the corner of the kitchen, what it would cost to build one onto the house in summer, what that would mean for what she could take on. She was planning. Not in the worried way she'd been planning for 2 years, the constant anxious calculation of barely enough. In the forward-facing way, the way that assumes there will be a future worth building toward. That was new, or rather it was old. It was how she'd thought before Martin died, and the years got hard and it had come back, and she had not quite realized how much she'd missed it until it returned. One evening in early May, Nell came inside from the yard and put something on the kitchen table. It was a small brown patch of fabric, not calico, not anything pretty, just the plain serviceable brown of the dress she'd been wearing in Calloway's store, that winter day, the one Cordelia Brask had mocked loud enough for everyone to hear. The hem patch, it had come off in the wash some weeks back, and Elspeth had set it aside, meaning to discard it, and somehow never had. I found this in your sewing box, Nell said. Elspeth looked at it. I should have thrown that out. Don't, Nell said. Elspeth looked at her daughter. Nell was looking at the patch with the particular expression she had when she'd been thinking about something for a while and had arrived somewhere. It's where it started, Nell said. Isn't it? Something like that, Elspeth said. Then it should stay, Nell said with the finality of a 9-year-old who has made a decision and expects it to be respected. Not because it was bad, because it was. Elspeth picked up the patch. She held it in her palm for a moment, this small, worn piece of cloth, nothing valuable, nothing beautiful. The thing that a woman had pointed at in a general store to make herself feel large by making a child feel small. She put it back in the sewing box, not in the bottom, where things go to be forgotten. Near the top, where things go that you mean to remember. Nell wore the blue calico dress for the first time on a Saturday in mid-May when the Cinder Hollow General Improvement Association held its spring market on the main street and half the county came in. Elspeth had finished it in March but had waited, for reasons she didn't entirely explain, for the right day. The dress fit well. She'd cut it carefully, with attention, the way she cut things when they mattered. It was the same deep October sky blue she'd seen on the bolt that winter morning, the same small white print that might be flowers or might be stars. On Nell it looked exactly right, not fancy, not costume, just right. The particular rightness of a color that suits a person's face and way of moving through the world. They walked into town together, down the main street where the market stalls were set up, past Callaway's general store where a different kind of mourning had started everything 6 months before, past the bank where Harriet Bloom was visible through the front window, reviewing documents with the no-nonsense attention of a woman who had inherited a mess and was methodically organizing it. Past the courthouse, through the market, people looked at Nell. Not the way they had looked in January. Not that look. This look was different. Recognizing something, the specific look of a small town that knows a story and is seeing a piece of it in front of them. A woman Elspeth vaguely knew from the church auxiliary stopped them near the vegetable stalls and bent down to Nell's level and said, "What a beautiful dress," with the complete sincerity of someone who means it. And Nell said thank you with her mother's dignified restraint and her father's barely suppressed smile. Cordelia Brask was at the market. Of course she was. Elspeth saw her from a distance, near the ribbon display of all things, and had a moment of decision about whether to alter her route. She decided not to. She walked the same direction she'd been walking, with Nell beside her, and they passed within 20 feet of Cordelia Brask and Mirabelle Sloane, who was still there, still in the lieutenant position. Cordelia saw them. There was a moment brief, visible only to someone watching for it, where her eyes went to Nell and then to the dress, and then to Elspeth, and then away. She said nothing. Elspeth said nothing. They walked past. That was all. And it was enough, more than enough, because the nothing they both said in that moment meant entirely different things, and they both knew it, and the difference was the whole story. Garrick came that afternoon, after the market, the way he'd been coming on Saturdays since March. With Bram, always. With something practical to discuss about the lease or the water intake schedule or the fence line that needed attention on the eastern boundary, there was always something real to discuss. Which Elspeth appreciated because it meant the visits had a foundation that didn't require either of them to perform an emotional shape they weren't yet ready for. They sat on the porch while Nell and Bram went off somewhere, and they talked about the water schedule for summer and about Harriet Bloom's preliminary assessment of the bank's records, which was turning up more to correct than anyone had initially expected, and about Harrison Fenwick, who was doing better, who had, according to Ada, been seen doing his own fence repairs last week with a vigor she hadn't seen in 2 years. "He told me something last week," Garrick said, Harrison. He said that the worst part of the whole thing wasn't the money or the fear of losing the farm. It was feeling like he was becoming someone who couldn't manage anymore. Like the farm was proving something about him that he didn't want proved. "Yes," Elspeth said, immediately without qualification. He looked at her. "That was it for you too. That's the thing about that kind of damage, she said. It's not just financial. It gets into your idea of yourself. Whether you're capable, whether you're someone who can hold things together or someone who can't. She paused. I thought for about 18 months that Martin would have done better, that he would have figured out the numbers somehow. That I was the weak part. You weren't, Garrick said. I know that now, she said. But knowing it now doesn't undo the 18 months of thinking it. She looked at the creek, running easy and full in the warm afternoon. What it does is it clarifies something about how you want to treat people, about what you notice when you're watching how someone is doing. He was quiet for a moment. What do you mean? I mean, she said slowly, that when you know what it feels like to be told, quietly and systematically, that you're failing, you get better at recognizing when someone else is being told the same thing. Whether the message is coming from a bank or a banker's wife, or just the general way a town looks at people who have less than average. She looked at him. Nell learned something this winter that I wish she hadn't needed to learn yet. About how people look at you when you have less, but she also learned something about what it looks like when people push back. And I'd rather she have both of those lessons than neither. Garrick sat with this. He did not rush past it. Bram learned something too, he said. About the difference between having money and having power over people. He paused. I've been careful about that with him, but careful isn't always the same as teaching it directly. This winter, what he watched happen here, and what he watched you do, I think that was more useful than anything I've said. Down by the creek, Nell's voice rose briefly and then fell back into whatever they were doing. Their own conversation, their own ordinary afternoon that would be part of what they remembered when they were grown, not the drama and the hearings and the frozen stakes in the ground, necessarily, but the fabric of the days around it. Porch, the creek sound. The fact that something very bad almost happened and then didn't, and that the people who stopped it were not distant or extraordinary, but were ordinary people who paid attention and refused to be quiet at the right moment. The evening light was doing what Maylight does in that part of the country, going warm and long, stretching the shadows of the fence posts far across the pasture, making the whole property look slightly larger and more golden than it did at noon, which is either an optical effect or the world's way of showing things their best face at the end of the day. Probably the former, but it was pleasant regardless. Elspeth looked at Willowglass Crossing in that light. At the repaired porch, at the barn with its new roof boards still showing bright against the weathered old ones. At the south field where the seed was already coming up in rows, early and promising. At the creek, running exactly where it had always run, in exactly the place that Martin's father had found it and built toward, and that Martin had paid for, and that she had, it turned out, finished paying for in the months after his death without knowing it. Hers. Fully, legally, completely, provably hers. The paper was in the tin box on the high shelf, next to the clean copy of the lease, both of them confirmed and witnessed and real. She had been fighting for something she already owned. That thought had visited her more than once since the hearing. She'd turned it over, looking for a lesson in it. What she kept arriving at was this. Sometimes you fight for years without knowing you've already earned the thing you're fighting for, because someone else is invested in making sure you don't find out. The fighting isn't wasted, it's the fighting that surfaces the truth. But there is something deeply wrong about a world where a person has to fight to learn what they already own. She intended to remember that, to let it change how she looked at people. At who was fighting and why, and what they might already have earned that someone else had made invisible. Garrick said something about the water intake schedule for July, and she answered him, and they talked practically and comfortably for another 20 minutes while the light went gold, and the creek ran on, and the children's voices moved back and forth along the bank. And it was an ordinary evening in early May at a farm called Willowglass Crossing, on a creek that belonged to the woman sitting on its porch, and it was fine. Not perfect. The Coulters were still gone, and Augusto Celis still had that pause in his sentences, And there was still a lot of world that worked the way Silas Varick had counted on it working. And one corrupt banker's removal from one small town was not an answer to that. But it was fine. It was genuinely solidly, fine. And that was worth something. And Elspeth Calder, who had spent 2 years nearly forgetting this, remembered it clearly now. The creek ran, the evening held, and somewhere in the sewing box inside, next to good thread and good scissors, and the blue calico scraps left over from a dress that a whole town had watched change the shape of things, there was a small brown patch of nothing special fabric that a 9-year-old had asked her mother to keep. Because it was where it started, and knowing where things start is how you make sure they don't start the same way again.